Okay, Megas, hello. Welcome to a new podcast in a new year. Been a bit of a gap since the last one, a bit longer than we had hoped, but circumstances have got in the way. But here we are, beginning of February, we're recording again. So, this episode, we're going to cover the recent ice and fire competition that Ray Duggins most capably organised at Battlefield Hobbies. So thank you to Ray for that, and thank you to Battlefield Hobbies for hosting us. Tonight, there's myself, there's Richard Jeffrey Cook, and Matt Hayward. So just the usual three. There is a chance Simon Hall will turn up, but he is at the moment very busy, obviously, with a number of projects, but we were hoping he would drop in and give us a bit of an update on what he's doing Meg-wise, and we might even let him plug some of his other projects as well, because some of them are no doubt of interest. We've got one little bit of housekeeping on the podcast to do, just to mention to anybody who doesn't know, we've got all the original series of podcasts, the one that Ray set up, the first 10 or so episodes, are along with the ones we've been recording more recently, all in one place now. So if you want to go back and rediscover some of the ones we did last year, please feel free. So, as I said, we're looking at the ice and fire competition as ever. We've got all the lists that were used up on my blog. If anybody hasn't seen the link so far, we'll be putting it in the notes when this podcast is published, so you'll be able to go and look and see what we're talking about. But otherwise, without further ado, as I always say, we'll move on to the meat of this podcast, where we will talk about our armies and our games and see how we did. I say that from the smug position because, as I'm sure a lot of people know, I did quite well. And we'll find out how Matt and Richard did as well. So I believe this will start off by going through our armies, then move on to the games. And Matt, I think you're going to kick us off with your army.
I will indeed. I meant to look up how to pronounce this. As far as I'm aware, it's Yothan Korean, but I'm open to anybody leaping in and telling me how it should be pronounced. Basically, it's the latest Korean in Meg, so it runs from about I think it's 1399 to the 16th century. I put my list in before I had my first game with the army, and my first game on Saturday morning was my second game ever with the army. So that sets the scene. It's not my fault, Gov. It was the army. Right.
Getting the excuses in there, Matt.
Absolutely. Always start with an excuse and then work your way up. Right. So it's a very interesting list in that I think it's the only list in Meg that allows cavalry that are skilled bow, short spear, shoot and charge protected. I've not come across any other list that had it. I had a search and I couldn't find any. So my list is 4 competent professional generals. Its terrain is standard coastal and mountains. I took a poor unfortified camp. It breaks on 6 tugs. It's PBS of 7, scouting of 4. So the first 2 units are standard Lancer cavalry, and they are drilled loose, average protected, charging Lancer, melee expert, 2 blocks of 4. Then my traditional cavalry delaying unit, if you wish to call it, from all of my armies. It's basic cavalry using bows, it's called, and it's cavalry formed flexible, average protected, unskilled bow, short spear, block of 4. Basically, they go off and slow people down. They die, whatever. Then we get into the good stuff, and it's best cavalry using bow. 2 units of formed flexible, average protected, skilled bow, short spear, shoot and charge. 2 blocks of 6. So I took the 12 bases. Then we have the guard archers. Now this is another fairly unique unit. It's infantry, drilled loose, superior, protected, skilled bow, block of 8. Again, not a combination you usually see, the combination of superior and skilled bow. We then have a spearman, for want of a better word, unit, the tug, which is infantry, drilled loose, average protected, polearm, block of 6. Then we get into the infantry. Now, the infantry are a bit like the Imperial Roman legions with their bolt shooters. They can have attached artillery. Now, The artillery is basically rocket-propelled arrows fired off in big blocks. From one opponent described them as prams, and another opponent described them as pianos. So it's the pram-wielding pianists, basically. But the interesting thing is they count as guns. They're light artillery and they count as guns. So it's a cab test if you charge them, range of 8 base widths, so on. You can have 1 per unit. So what I ended up with was 4 missile-based infantry blocks of 6, each one having an artillery piece attached, which can either be archer or crossbow. So 2 blocks of archers, so they are drilled loose infantry, average protected, experienced bow, combat shy. 5 of those and an artillery piece. So there's 2 blocks of 6. And then the crossbowmen are identical, but obviously I've got crossbows, 2 blocks of 6. The only thing with the list is they have to be combat shy, which is unfortunate, because if they weren't, I think they'd be really quite tasty. So that's 11 tugs. So that's the bulk of the army. You then have 3 blocks of skirmishers, which are skirmishing archers, which are infantry skirmishers, average unprotected, experienced bow, combat shy, block of 6. 2 blocks of handgunners, which are infantry skirmished, poor unprotected, experienced firearm, 2 blocks of 6. And that gives you a round total of 14, so it's 5 on a deployment, and allows you to put plenty of stuff down without giving away where you want to put the good stuff. So that was basically the army list. After my first test game, I already knew I was in for a struggle, which I'm happy to talk about later. But there you go. That's the army.
Different.
Yes, held up really well, actually. I am surprised at how well it performed, considering my specialist limitations. But anyway.
Yeah, we'll talk about the game we had in the second round later on, but I'll describe my army first, and then we can come on to the games. So my army was Tang China Northern, so roughly about 650 CE. So China at its sort of height of its expansion, really. And I took basically 2 competent professional and 1 mediocre professional generals, and then a competent ally, the ally being pre-dynastic Khitan. Had a poor unfortified camp, 7 PBS and 4 scouting, so quite respectable. I had 11 tugs and 1 sug. The main units were, first off, the Wuxi cavalry. I don't know whether that's the correct pronunciation, but it's something like that. Form loose, average protected, experienced bow, charging lancer, melee expert. And that gives a flavour of the army. The next couple of units of cavalry, form loose, average protected, experienced bow, short spear, melee expert. Followed by 4 units of mixed Bubing. They are Bubing spearmen and Bubing archers. So the units are of 6, 3 of each. The spearmen forming the front ranks are form flexible, average protected, experienced bow, short spear, melee expert. And the rear ranks of the archers are just formed loose, average protected, experienced bow. So what you've got there is a archer unit with a pretty tough front line. And you have to distinguish the figures front rank from rear rank, obviously, in that situation. Along with those 4 infantry units, I had a unit of guard spearmen. These are quite tough. They're drilled, flexible, superior protected, experienced bow, short spear, melee expert. And in this case, all 6 of them are short spear, melee expert. That's the main Chinese forces, along with a sug of nomadic light cavalry, who are skirmisher, average, unprotected, experienced bow, Cantabrian, combat shy. And then the ally consists of 3 units, The heavy cavalry, Khitan heavy cavalry, or form loose, average protected, experienced bow, short spear. That was just a unit of 4. And then I had 2 units of form flexible, average, unprotected, bow, combat shy. One of them is a 6 of experience, the other is 6 skilled bow. What you'll notice is that everybody in the army carries a bow. And they're all experienced apart from the skilled bow and the light cavalry who are Cantabrians. So you've got a large amount of shooting power with this army. And yeah, that was my choice. I had used it quite successfully in practice games before coming to the competition, so I was reasonably hopeful.
I think it's a nice army, Richard. Before we maybe come back and just have a quick chat about what we each think about our armies, I just ask one question on the Tang one. I've always thought it looked quite a nice army, but I can't remember people using it very often. You get any thoughts why?
Not really. I've used it once before, and did reasonably well with it. I can't see any reason not to use it.
I've ordered the lead for it after playing Richard.
Was this after playing me?
Yes, after playing you, because I really liked it. I thought it was a really interesting combination of troops.
There you are, yeah. Well, actually, I think yours is as well, Matt. Actually, just while we're on that, you said about you can't think of it. The skilled shooting cavalry with shoot and charge. You say you can't think of other ones. So it got me thinking with my list nerd head on. And I must admit, the only other skilled shooters, sort of protected shoot and charge type cavalry I can think of are some of the guard types, like in the Mamluks. Who then are drilled close, so they're quite different from those in that Korean. I don't know if anything's jumped to Richard's mind that would be similar to those Koreans.
Not that I can think of off the top of my head, I must admit.
So you might be right. They could be unique, Matt. There's a challenge to all our listeners. See if you can find something that's the same. There's only 650 odd lists to go through. So anyway, on to my army. In some ways, my army has some similarities with Richard's. Comes from about 300 years later. It's the later Zhou and early Northern Song list. This is a list from the end of the 5 dynasties period, which is post-Tang, and then into the early Northern Song, who managed to reunify most of China, though didn't quite make it to the same sort of territorial extent that the Tang did. So my list it's 4 competent professional generals, which is a fairly standard approach these days. Terrain, get with this, is standard plains and mountains. I went for a poor unfortified camp, didn't sink any points into there. The army came out with a PBS of 7, a scouting of 2. Quite a shock for me. He's usually using the horse archer armies. I get a lot more than that, but there you go. That's your choices. I had 11 tugs and a sug. The tugs were set with a guard cavalry. Sank a lot of points into these. Drilled close, superior, armoured horse protected, experienced bow, short spear, melee expert, shoot and charge. Then 3 units of formed loose cavalry, average protected, experienced bow, short spear. These were all 4s. Sorry, the guard was a 6 base unit. I think if you're going to go for that unit, you go big or go home. 2 units what are called vanguard swordsmen. 8 bases each of formed flexible, average protected, short spear, melee expert. I then had 4 units of crossbowmen infantry, well, mixed spearmen crossbowmen, in the same way that Richard's army had his Fubing. These are the sort of later version. Front ranks are drilled flexible, average protected, experienced crossbow, short spear, melee expert. And the rear ranks are just drilled loose, protected crossbow. 3 bases of each, so 6 bases in a unit. And last but not least, some raw militia archers. Infantry, tribal loose, poor unprotected, experienced bow, combat shy. So they rounded out to the 11 tugs, but actually experienced bow means they are quite useful, and they did indeed fulfill quite a useful function in the games. And 1 unit of skirmishers, cavalry skirmishers, average unprotected, experienced bow, Cantabrian, combat shy. So I said quite similar to Richard's. I suppose one of the big differences is my infantry have got crossbow instead of bow. So that obviously if they're charged, they get that advantage of being able to score wounds when rolling an S, which is incredibly useful. Okay, folks, so that was my list. As I said, I thought both, but Matt's and Richard's were interesting. So I don't know what they think of everybody else's lists.
I'd been fascinated to play your army, actually. I think that would have been a real tussle of a game.
Yes, I think so.
Given the matchups, but yeah, wouldn't have liked to predict the outcome of that one.
No, I think it could have gone a long way. We both got quite a lot of average, but the armies have quite a lot of average stuff in there. So
actually, I think all three of us only had one superior, 2 superior units maybe between us. I only had 1 in mine.
Yeah,
I had only Did I have any superiors in mine?
You had your guard infantry, didn't you?
I think just the guard infantry. Yeah,
they're a stonking unit, though.
Yeah, you pay for them.
Oh yes.
Yeah, they were the core of my army. Actually, they were prepared to take on anybody, because there's not really many troops that they're a pushover to.
No, I think they're very effective. In fact, they're flexible as well means as is a lot of your army. Terrain is a bit of a case of we don't mind.
Yeah, I was not really fussed to terrain at all.
Yeah, I just want to ask Matt. With all that infantry, as you say, is combat shy. How much of a holding you back was that, if at all?
If at all. On retrospect from the game, I would say I probably only needed 3 units. 4 never got into the line. Basically, there was always 3 that were effective, and 1 that was always just hanging around at the back and never got into the fight. Honestly, the combat shy made no difference whatsoever. The artillery gave some people pause, and the cab test and being charged gave them another pause. And I have to say, in 2 of my games, I was very aggressive with the infantry, and they actually did what they were supposed to do. Don't think I lost an infantry tug in the entire weekend.
Oh, right.
Might have lost 1. Lost the skirmishers, but that's what they're paid for.
Yeah.
But
well, I never got into your infantry, certainly.
No.
Okay.
But yeah, no. I rate them, but there were handicaps from my generalship rather than anything else, to be perfectly honest.
I suppose my usual question for rating these things is: would you use it again?
Yes, I've slightly redesigned it, and it will be hitting the table again. Assuming I can find space amongst the other 2 people who have already emailed me for my list and said, I'm buying the figures. Really?
Whose figures did you use for it?
Essex.
Oh, they've got a range for it, haven't they?
They've got a dedicated. It's technically in their Renaissance range, but I think if you pan the list to around the 1500s, you'd probably get away with it. They're pretty nice.
As if you're going to meet a medieval Korean expert who's going to be able to tell the difference.
This is very true, yes. And I have to say, Nick provided me with a link for the flags, which was excellent. They were really good flags, and so it really added to the army. So I was really pleased with that.
Yeah, I thought it looked really nice, as your armies usually do. So, and Richard, will you use the Tang again?
I certainly hope to be using the Tang in competitions later this year. It's eligible for a few of them, so watch out, world.
Yeah, well, it's definitely not. I would be most open to using my early Northern Song again. I certainly performed better than I thought I would, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Not just because of doing well, I thoroughly enjoyed the difference from playing an army with quite a lot of infantry. Anyway, enough of that. Talking of games, Matt, do you want to give us a rundown of your games? And you've already realised that you and Richard played, so I'll let you deal with that however it works best for both of you.
Indeed. Right. First game of the Saturday was Poor Stovall with Abyssinian, which is as I knew the draw earlier on, I'd had a look through the army list, and it was a really interesting mix of tribal skilled bow, experienced non-formed bow, loads of loose order drilled loose short spear melee expert infantry, and I guess there'd be a Mogadishu ally, which is basically Mamluks and light horse. As it turns out, that's exactly what he took. I honestly can't remember who attacked or who defended. To be honest, I think I probably attacked, but the game plan going in was basically defensive line of infantry, cavalry behind it, and then pick my spot and try and knock a hole through it. So we did the terrain. I wanted loads of rough, so obviously I think we ended up with 2 pieces on the table. It was billiard table besides that from where we were. But having said that, it was one of those, it was a rough going hill, dead in the center in my deployment area. And Paul put down a vineyard on a hill on my left flank, and it had to touch the edge. So it ended up moving back, I think. So it was right at the back. So basically, the table cut in half. So I deployed my infantry from my left flank. I put the pole arms as far out to the left as they could go. Then there was a crossbow. Then I put the skilled archers behind them, a unit of handgunners, and then the 4 blocks of pianist wielding infantry. I'd be careful how I say that, and but they ran all the way to the rough going hill. One unit was in fact deployed on the rough going hill, which with the artillery rules for integrated into infantry makes it slightly static in that you could only move them one base width. They move as battle wagons, effectively battle wagon speed. So obviously in rough going, a battle wagon only moves 1. But the idea was they would just stand on the hill and basically allow their line to swivel, clockwise across to his vineyard. All the cavalry obviously went behind the infantry line. The handgunners were interspersed with the lancers behind them, basically. So the lancers could just pootle through the handgunners. That was the theoretical deployment I had in my mind when I put the army together. Was basically the lancers sit behind the handgunners. So if you rush infantry towards my combat shy archers, the lancers can come out and either countercharge or intercept charge. That was, and it seemed to work well. It pause for thought, shall we say, for some people. So the game kicks off. I'm quite aggressive with the infantry from the left flank forward. As I say, I'm aiming to clockwise wheel into the center of the table up to his vineyard, and then pick my point where I want to throw the cavalry in. Paul responded in a similar fashion. He sent all his cavalry, it's 3 units of light horse, I think it was, a unit of average formed loose, and his superior Mamluk experienced bow towards my rough going hill, with the aim of looping round the rough going hill into my camp and into the back of my line. And that's pretty much how it played out. That's exactly what happened. My infantry pushed forward. My lancers came out to engage the Abyssinians of a loaded tribal foot and the drilled loose foot and the archers. So there was a mixture of a lot of shooting in the middle, and by using the skirmishers, I was able to get the lancers into his spearman foot and then expand into his archers on either side. So basically I never got shot at. And so the 2 blocks of 4 lancers actually were engaged quite early on into his foot in the center. That was working. I made a classic mistake where, you put an army on the table and you haven't actually read all your factors. So my polearm infantry rushed towards his vineyard in a single rank. considering they were faced off against other infantry, which was spear melee expert, that was a slight mistake. As I promptly got into combat and realised that in melee I have to be in 2 ranks to count the polearm. So
well, against infantry you do,
yeah, against infantry, exactly. So that became a damage limitation exercise there, and then the skilled bow never really got into the fight because I just held them well back. As soon as I realised I'd made the mistake, I didn't want anybody anywhere near those polearms when they eventually went. Oddly, the handgunners that had gone up with them survived an inordinate amount of shooting and slowed down a couple of his charges, and stunning job for poor unprotected handgunners. It was brilliant. But I don't think Paul thought quite that way. Sorry. And so I was making inroads into his infantry. He swept round the rough-going hill towards my camp. I'd sent my delaying unit of 4 experienced bow onto the rough-going hill, in fact, to threaten his advance, whilst my skilled bow cavalry were forming a line ready for him to come round. Interesting, that's one of the limitations of this army. I really should have. It's 4 competent generals, so a total of 12 cards. I really should have gone with a talented general and a mediocre general. Still kept the 12 cards, but what I found was every game I played, I needed somebody who started with 4 cards. Not the army commander, but any of the sub-generals start with 4 cards, and then I can give him a 5th. Because I found with 3 cards with the +1 from the general, because he wasn't floating, army card, I never quite had enough cards to respond quite as quickly as I wanted to some situations, and it caused quite a lot of snarl ups. So I didn't react fast enough to a few of the situations. Anyway, the end result was, because we got into shooting and combat quite early, it took a lot of time to resolve, and we never finished the game. The end result, as is always the way, it was looking at something like a 10-6 to me, up until the point I made a slight miscalculation with where I placed unit of cavalry, so he got into my camp. It's always the way. He managed to get 2 bases of his, a column of 6 of his average formed loose straight into the side of the camp, because the unit I'd left ready to intercept charge was just too far away, because it was partially in the rough going. Anyway, the end result of that was he hit the camp, destroyed the camp. The combat tests from that managed to cascade break 3 of my tugs, because 1 broke, and then the other one was feeling slightly dodgy, took a skull, then a wound, then broke, and then the next one it cascaded through. So in the end, it was 10-12 to a Paul. Thoroughly excellent game. It worked as I expected it to work. As I say, made 2 errors that cost me, which was the polearms, which died in fairly short order, and not quite covering the camp properly. So it was so. As I say, really good game. Gave me 10 points, which I was not unashamed for, and that set me up for Richard on Saturday afternoon.
Shall I describe my first game, and then we can talk about our second round game?
Yeah, sure.
No problem. That's a good way of doing it. Yeah.
So my first round game was against Ian Crosby, who's a relative newcomer, I believe, to make, and he was using a Glycobactrian army, which is one of my sort of pet favourites, because back at university I actually did a history of the Glycobactrian kingdoms as part of my university degree. So the army he took was essentially the all-mounted option. So he actually had 9 units of cavalry and 3 skirmishing units of cavalry along with that. A mix of the guard cavalry, who are Greek superior protected charging lancer, Iranian line cavalry, who are charging lancer melee expert per average, cataphracts, and some Sarka horse archers, who are the flexible average unprotected experienced bow. The terrain came out as plains. There was enough of a flank for me to anchor my right flank with infantry, and the game basically became a contest of the Bactrians pushing forward, and my response in shooting away what I could. And it was a frustration from my perspective was that I came a wound off breaking his army. I got 4 tugs. I needed a 5th, and the 5th was a wound off breaking when time was called.
Oh no.
So I ended up, I think it was something like a 10-7 result, but fair dues to Ian. And yeah, it was just close, but not quite there. So I ended up on 10 points, but a very different 10 points probably from the way that Matt had got to 10 points. And hence we met for the second round.
I totally don't remember which one of us invaded, to be perfectly honest, because I think our armies were pretty similar for what terrain.
I've got a feeling you invaded, but
yeah,
I must admit I wouldn't be 100% sure.
It probably sounds like me.
Yeah. I seem to remember you certainly pushed your sacrificial cavalry up very quickly against my Khitan, who I'd deployed on my right and your left.
Indeed. Yes, you're quite right. Yes, I did invade. So we ended up with a secure, rough-going flank, from what I can remember. Not a lot of terrain anywhere else. I think you may have had a vineyard or a rough-going hill on your back edge, but I think
nothing that affected the subsequent battle, certainly.
Indeed. So my battle plan, such as it was I deployed the skirmishing archers, the polearms, the skilled guard archers on the secure right flank, with the aim of pushing through that way. And then in the good going next to them, I had the 2 blocks of skilled archers, then all the infantry with the lancers intermingled, running out towards my left. I did leave my left slightly out, open, but that was the purpose of the delaying unit, was to at least give me a turn or two where I could force on my left and in the center. That was the aim anyway. That was what I was trying to do.
It gave you a turn.
Yeah, all right. You're shooting convinced that the sacrificial unit really was a sacrificial unit. As you say, it lasted a turn, but
got a bit close, did it?
Well, to be fair, I just marched it up to 4, and then Richard came up to 3, and
he didn't have 2 skilled files and 3 experience files or something shooting at it.
It was 5 or 6 dice you threw at
something like that, and it was only a unit of 4, and it decided
it disappeared.
2 skulls and a wound later, it wasn't.
Yeah, that's right. I think I'd regaled you with how Hammy had actually destroyed it to a man or a similar unit, and then you promptly did pretty much the same thing. So, but that was what it was expected to do.
But
so
that was merely to lure me in, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, that was the plan. Yeah. It was like a feigned retreat, but more bloody, so to speak.
Because I'm then thinking there's this nice flank that looks as if it's in a bit of a mess, with a couple of 4s of Lancer cavalry that are looking vulnerable. So I advanced my Khitans and the Wuxi cavalry, who are the charging Lancer melee expert, forward. Line it up. So I think your Lancers were essentially in a position where they had to charge me.
Yes, you boxed me in. You'd done half a bull's horn, so to speak. You completely wrapped around me. Although I had managed to turn one of my infantry units 90 degrees and expand it against your skirmishers to give a bit of a security.
But the basic idea was you'd come into me, I'd get the shooting as you came in, and then we'd be on a pretty even melee contest.
Yeah.
With the opportunity to get into your flank with one of my flexibles. And the plan worked fine. The execution was sort of mucked up by a couple of skulls on green versus green dice that broke my Wuxi cavalry, and bang went a really good plan.
Yeah, that pretty much sums that up. Yeah, it was. And then I was equally failing to throw the right dice I needed on the other side of the flank with the shooting and
Yeah, those skilled bow were. I mean, we had quite an epic contest between my infantry and your skilled bow, which left my infantry non-existent and your skilled bow so weak that they couldn't really do much after that.
Absolutely. I do recall your elite guard infantry died to the skilled bowman though in combat, the mounted combat.
Yeah, well, you had this trick of shoot and charging to weaken as you charge in, and it turned out to be one of those ones where we were sort of taking bases off pretty equally.
Yeah.
And whoever survived was going to be struggling to carry on.
Yes,
regardless.
You reversed back two of your normal infantry units, hadn't you? So the polearms never reached them. I think by the end of the game, you were on the base edge, and I was,
I was playing a sort of desperate game of trying to stay out of the range of the skilled archers and keeping out of the range of the polearms as well. Yeah. On my extreme left, your right flank. So when time was called, it was I was sort of nowhere left to run, but fortunately I had survived long enough on that flank.
You claim night fell.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I think it was a 10-8 to me in the end. I think
I scored 7, I believe. So I think must have got a skirmisher and two tugs rather.
Yeah, I think one of the handgunners.
I came away feeling that I could have got at least a couple more. So
you were robbed when those 2 units of 4 lancers went into your good cavalry with the Kitans in support. It was I'm not denying it in any way. The green just threw it totally, and I think your shooting of me on the way in was.
I think I missed entirely with the shots on the way in, and I had 5 or 6.
Yeah. I think you maybe did a wound, which I recovered before it impacted the block before.
Yeah, that and the impact combat where I blanked out. So yes, it was a promising situation, but didn't go with me on that occasion.
Yeah,
but there is always next time.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll end up using Tang against you next time, and then that'll be a switch.
I doubt I'll be using the Joseon Korean. I don't think that's an army for me personally.
I surprisingly enjoyed it. It's a quiet taste. I'll definitely give it that. But it did fulfill my criteria of using an army with more infantry than cavalry tugs for this year. So that was although the combat wing was still cavalry. But anyway, that's so.
I'll go on with mine. Okay, so my first game was against Dave Parrish. Always an all-round splendid bloke. Love playing Dave. Always have great games. We always seem to have something weird and wonderful happens in the games. Although to be fair, I don't think we did in this one. Now I've said that. Dave was using Khwarezmian. And I believe from what he said, this is really his first essay into steppe type armies. So I suppose it might have been a bit unfair that he drew somebody who's used them a lot. So, but that's the way of the world. Obviously Khwarezmian is one we covered in a previous podcast as well, and I've used against Richard, who beat me, shot me to death. If I remember, Richard, didn't you?
I got lucky.
Actually, I think it was that the game where we both did very well on shooting, but you did better than me. We were just shoveling bases off by the handful, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, we had one turn of shooting where I could barely miss, and you did reasonably well, and I
Well,
just
about to say, it's one of those I did quite well, you just did well. Anyway, on to Dave's army. Dave took an army with 2 allies in it. Both had talented instinctive generals. One was a Turkoman, 4 units of form flexible, unprotected cavalry. Half of them were skilled shooters. They were all in 4s. His other ally was a Kankali ally, which had 2 more units, each of 4 of unprotected, experienced bow flexible cavalry, and 2 units of tribal loose, average protected, devastating chargers. Only 6s, but that's all you can have in the list. And his actual Khwarezmian part of it, I suppose, were a unit of 2 elephants, 2 tugs of the Khwarezmian lancers, who I really quite like. They're formed loose, superior protected, experienced bow, charging lancer, shoot and charge. Very nice. And a unit of Iranian Askaris, drilled loose, average protected, experienced bow, short spear. And he had 2 competent professional generals to drive those. So he had a goodly amount of command and control. Dave, the 2 things now are now a theme for all 4 of my games. So I'll get it out of the way straight up. Dave rolled a skull to win the PBS dice roll off, so he could do the strategic intercept. All 4 of my opponents did that to me. It was green each time, and I lost I lost the skull to something less than the skull each time. So each time I defended, and each time we ended up with a secure flank of mountains and forests. So we ended up with the compulsory big piece of terrain, 2 pieces of terrain, in this case on my left flank. Actually, it was always my left flank as well, because of the table I was playing on. So the basic start to the game looked very similar in all cases. Against Dave, I then had a couple of vineyards in the central sector towards the back of the table, and there was a village on Dave's side, but otherwise it was free, nice open terrain. Vineyards will become a bit of a theme in this as well. Dave out-scouted me by a bit, and I deployed my army basically between the big hill on my left and vineyard on my right, putting infantry in the vineyards, mainly shooters, to exploit the lovely thing from vineyards where you count as in cover, but you can shoot out and you don't get penalised, which is very nice. And my cavalry base, the guard were in the front line, and the rest of the cavalry was more or less in support. Dave deployed with his Turkoman ally on his right, his Askaris and the Lancers more or less in his centre, and the left were his Kankali troops. The devastating charger types were pointing at the vineyard that was on my right. Obviously, he was just going to pile in the dev chargers into whatever he had there, and his left flank was the couple of units of the Kankali horse archers to cover the flank. Now, obviously, I'm set up in a fairly nice defensive position there, but I do have a plan of coming out. Dave pretty much advances straight towards me across the board. I move up to as far as I can go while staying in the terrain to see how things develop, to see whether Dave will push on and come into shooting range, basically. He did on the left. His devastating charges definitely had one aim in mind, to go and devastatingly charge my crossbowmen who were in the vineyard. On his right, he pushed the Turkmen up cautiously. I mean, he's well aware that they were unprotected, and I did have some shooters up there, though not many. In the centre, he sort of slowly advanced the cavalry. He did keep his elephants in reserve, being a 2-base unit. I think he thought they were potentially vulnerable, and given the amount of shooting I have, I think he was right. I think if they'd been anywhere near the front, I would have gone, oh look, there's an easy target. I'll just shoot them with numerous crossbows, and hopefully they'll evaporate really quickly. David was hindered on his left with his Kankali troops by some fairly rubbish cards for a fair chunk of the game. and I got to shoot with my crossbowman from the vineyards at his oncoming devastating charge infantry, which both slowed them up and one unit knocked some bases off. They did eventually charge in, both charged together, and one of them charged into a unit of my crossbowmen and pretty much ran straight over the top of them. But his other unit was first slowed so they didn't make contact, and then basically shot to death. Because of these, I think the mixed results on that flank, Dave pushed his cavalry forward towards my infantry and cavalry in the centre, and was tempted to bring his Turkmen a bit closer to try and get these skilled shooters into the game. Unfortunately, this meant I could then engineer my shooting on that flank to be shooting at him whilst not being shot at myself, because obviously foot shooters have longer range than mounted shooters. And Dave's Turkmen in fours were in loose formation, so I was getting the colour upgrade for shooting at unprotected cavalry. And at this point, I even brought the poor unprotected tribal archers up to do some shooting as well, because obviously, again, they can do it from out of range, and they're experienced shooters. It's one reason I did keep them as experienced shooters in the game. So, and that actually went fairly badly for Dave. The militia archers were more or less responsible for shooting two of his Turkmen units to death on their own, with just a little bit of help from other troops. So they well and truly earned their pay that day, if we pay the militia, that is, and were certainly well worth the value in points. Because of what was going on the flanks, then we ended up with a melee combat between the cavalry in the middle. I ended up with my guard cavalry, more or less fighting both units of his lancers, although I was assisted by one of my vanguard swordsman units. Dave's lancer charge was, I think Dave would probably call it disappointing. So that was the point he was up. And after that, the melee combat was even more disappointing, as my guard cavalry seemed to develop a knack for rolling skulls on green dice, and they were joined by the vanguard infantry. And it didn't actually take too long, and I'd broken both units of the lancers, which I think was pretty damn harsh on Dave, and opened a blooming great hole in the middle. So the game essentially was wrapped up by taking out the aforementioned devastating charger units and the units of Turkmen who got basically caught by shooting and shot to death, and his Iranian Askaris also succumbed to shooting along the way. So, I have to say, it's a first time out for Dave with a steppe cavalry army involving quite a lot of shooting cavalry in fours and unprotected. I always say it's a harsh learning experience when you start with these armies, and facing off against basically a shooting infantry army is probably not going to be your best matchup ever. I said it was a great game against Dave as always. I think he enjoyed it. I trust he did, and hopefully, I hope he sticks with the steppe cavalry armies and gives them a bit more of a go. So that then set me up for a second competition in a row, where on Saturday afternoon I played Paul Cummings. Paul had an early Fatimid army, which is an army I quite like as well. Although it's a desperately frustrating list. It's one of those I know there's a good list in there somewhere, but I can never quite get it on paper armies. Keep going back to it, and I know Paul does the same because we chat about it quite frequently. And a different iteration. Anyway, this version, he had 4 competent professional generals, 2 units of the long spear lancer cavalry in 6s, 2 units of Mamluks, superior protected experienced bow short spear in 4s, a unit of skilled bow Turkmen's, form flexible, average unprotected, 2 units of the Abid infantry, comprising of 6 bases of short spear melee expert and 2 bases of two-handed cut and crush. It's a mixed unit. The unit of Sarirea, who are a unit of 8 long spear. Now they're all, along with the Abid, they're all close formation. A unit of Daylami, drill flexible, average protected, devastating charger, melee expert, 8 bases of those. That's one of those, why wouldn't you have it in the army units when you look at the list. You had 2 units of Berber light horse, skirmishing javelin, and 1 unit of Berber javelinmen, skirmisher infantry. So you had 9 tugs and 3 sugs. So as I've already said, the terrain basically fell very similar to the game against Dave. We had the secure flank on my left, there was a vineyard on my right, and we had 2 woods in the table, one left of centre as I was looking at it and another on the right hand side, and a nice big open space for the infantry to deploy in the middle. Paul deployed with cavalry on both wings. His right wing was quite strong with the Mamluks, Mamluks and a unit of the long spear cavalry. On the left he had another unit of long spear cavalry, the Turkmen and the skirmishing light horse. And his centre was made up of all the Abid and the Sararia, and the Daylami, unsurprisingly, were pointing directly at the small wood that was to my left centre. I somewhat mirrored this. I had some cavalry on my left, along with a unit of vanguard swordsmen who were going to try and contain Paul's right wing and the Daylami. My right wing had a unit of the crossbow infantry on the extreme right, then the guard cavalry, and then the rest of the infantry in the centre. So in many ways, quite conventional deployments. What I haven't mentioned, I should have mentioned earlier on, is that the scouting for this was quite extreme. Paul had 4 scouting, I had 2. For his scouting, Paul produced 4 yellows. So I was fully expecting to be quite heavily out-scouted till I most outrageously drew 2 reds. So we ended up with nobody out-scouted, although as defender I deployed first. So that was quite a a wow moment in a way. I've been wondering how much of my army am I going to have to deploy? Oh, just a third apparently. So that worked well enough for me. Okay, the game involved basically the infantry centres moved towards each other, unsurprisingly. Initially, Paul withdrew his cavalry on his right, and he was trying to tempt me to overcommit my left wing cavalry, as his cavalry were more numerous and had a qualitative advantage because of the Mamluks. I almost took the bait and then stopped myself at the last minute and didn't push too far forward. On my right, he advanced his cavalry there, and I advanced the guard cavalry and my right-hand unit of crossbowmen. I was aiming to get the crossbowmen shooting at the Turkmen cavalry, so unprotected cavalry again, but I know Paul's been burned by that one before and quite wisely kept them in skirmish formation so that if we did exchange shots, he would be shooting on greens and I would be shooting on whites, although I would have more shooting. My plan between the infantry was I've got crossbowmen, he's got no shooters, so I was going to advance to shooting range and then basically force him to keep advancing because I can cause damage at range and he can't, and I would fall back in front of him in what I like to think is the approved manner to get as many shots in to weaken him before we got to combat. And that's more or less how it panned out in the centre. On the right, I had a bit of a rush of blood after a couple of moves, and with the success my guard cavalry had had against Dave, I'd obviously got into my head that they were a bit invulnerable and could go and fight anything. And I charged them at a unit of Paul's long spear cavalry and completely missed the fact that Paul would just be able to intercept them with the long spear infantry. Obviously, that means I count my short spear and get a plus for fighting infantry who are charging, but they're long spear infantry. And once they get into melee, I'm really not happy. And so it panned out. I basically had thrown my guard cavalry away. I did very little damage to them, and suddenly I got a bit of a hole on that side of the line, going, that was a mistake, wasn't it? Try not to do that again. Fortunately, my infantry shooting was quite good, and I was knocking some bases off his Abid. So that really was forcing him to come forward, to keep pressing forward. If he tried to withdraw, I would really have just been able to keep up with him. So it was push on, push on, push on. And the Dale Army were coming through the wood. On the other side of the wood where I got, after pushing my cavalry forward and realizing I wasn't going to overcommit them, Paul turned his right wing cavalry round again and started to push me back because he had greater numbers. So after that, we then had what was basically an almighty crunch between all the infantry. Paul pushed the Dale Army out of the woods straight into the face of my unit of vanguard swordsmen. But here he made a bit of a mistake because he was moving them straight at me. He moved them in such a way that I ended up with one file of my frontage behind his flank, which was a bit unfortunate for Paul. It was just one of those mistakes you make. So the following move, one of my files charged into his flank whilst the others were fighting frontally. I'm on a red and a green, and to add insult to injury, I rolled 2 skulls. So kaboom, 2 bases off. The rest of the infantry fight goes well for me to begin with, although I lose one of the units. And in fact, at this point, we reached the point where I'd lost 2 units and Paul had lost 1. And it was all, I was actually starting to get a bit worried. I think I was unduly worried, actually, because then the following move, especially my vanguard swordsmen who were fighting in the centre, broke 2 more of his units. We shot down a Mamluk unit, and then resulting cabs ensured that basically Paul lost 4 units in very short order. And suddenly I'm basically 5 units to 2 up. And then the game ended because Paul threw some troops in to try and get some points, because at this point it was almost certainly going to go badly for him. I picked up the last point and won 15-4. So I got 15-4 there and a 15-3 there. So max points after day 1. Can't complain with that.
Good opponents as well. So yeah.
Yeah, no, two great games. I say Paul did make the mistake. It was one of those casual moves. You just push the unit forward because we know there's going to be a fight next time, and basically he just went half a base width too far with the Dale Army. So, and if that hadn't happened, actually, the way the units were placed, it would have been a lot closer after that, and Paul might have been able to win it. But that sort of sealed his army.
Yeah, it's small things can get you.
They can, because when the combat finished against the Dale Army, I was able to reform my unit, and he'd been working his second unit of Mamluks to try and charge him in the flank, and then when I reformed, I could reform out of range of his flank charge. But if he'd been able to flank charge me while I was still in combat, that would have really opened up a flank for me. So it is small things. Small things can make a big difference. And I got away with thinking my guard cavalry were invulnerable when they quite patently weren't.
Happens to the best of us and the worst of us. Yeah.
At some stage, it happens to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, so enough of me rabbiting on about those 2 games. Back to Matt.
Excellent. Right.
The Sunday.
Yes. So Sunday morning, as I say, it was Sir Robin and his later Crusaders. Yeah, I think I had the Sunday morning. I was going to say I hadn't been drinking, but yeah. Anyway, we went for as much terrain on the table as possible, and of course got none of it. So the we had a river on one flank, and Robin had, I think it was a gentle hill in his furthest right corner, my left, and that was it basically. And I think he even outscouted me, just to add insult to injury, considering it's a Crusader army with no decent scouting troops. So there you go. Anyway, I made my first mistake of the game, which basically cost me the game. I went wide, and I don't know why I did it. I basically put all the infantry from the river to the center of the table and all my cavalry. So 3/4 of the table in a line. The only reserve I had was, ironically, the unit I usually use to slow the enemy down, so the 4 unit of cavalry. And Robin mirrored me, basically. He put all his infantry out against mine, and then all his cavalry out on the flank facing mine. Now, I really like Robin's later Crusader list. He's running it's one of the Turk allies. I can't remember which one, but basically it's 3 blocks of Mamluk cavalry. So
it's an Ayyubid Syrian states ally.
I knew you'd know.
And it is a nice list. I do like this list of Robins.
Yeah, it really well put together, really well thought out. It's got to be something Lawrence came together, Sid, and gave to him.
I think that's really, really harsh. I think it was I think I suggested it to him, actually.
The greats came to his assistance. I wish you hadn't. I really do.
Robin has played around with it. I think he's come up with a very, very nice list.
It's really tight. It's really nice. Yeah. So basically, it's 3 Mamluk blocks of 6 superior, experienced bow, short spear. And backing that up, he had 4 superior full fat knights of the brother orders, and a block of 6 Crusader knights, and then 3 or 4 blocks of the big crossbow, short spear, front rank, shield cover guys as infantry. Yes, how best to describe this? A rush of blood, I think, was the phrase you used earlier, Nick, and I think that basically sums up what I managed to do. My infantry, well, the plan was the infantry would move forward and shoot at his infantry, basically because his shield cover doesn't matter to my artillery, so he's got a choice. He either slows himself down to take the shield cover from my normal shooting, or he doesn't, and the artillery will shoot through it anyway. So that was it. The infantry was going to go through there. The end of my line on my left of the infantry was where the skilled shooters, the guard infantry, were. Then they had the pole arms, and then all my cavalry. So my plan was to go forward to engage his cavalry, but I was going to charge in with everything, with the cavalry, with the pole arms coming up and the guard archers coming up. The aim was then to take the cab, but pull the 2 skilled shoot and charge cavalry out, leaving the 2 blocks of 4 lancers fighting his single end Mamluk line, giving him a bit of an issue of how to deal with it, because basically he was going to end up with pole arms facing off against one end of his Mamluk line, 2 blocks of, well, assume you're taking casualties, 10 or 9 skilled shooters in the middle shooting at his block of 6 unengaged, and then I've got 8 melee expert Lancer cavalry facing off against superior Mamluks that don't have melee expert. So the idea was I was hoping to break the end of the line, shoot out the middle, pole arms were going to delay the other, and that was the theory. What happened, obviously, was this goes back to me talking about having a talented general with 4 cards. I got myself in a position to do it, and then got, I think it was 1 green and 3 blacks, and 2 blacks. So I was stuffed, basically. But the general threw over another green. The army commander managed to throw over another green, which meant I could still charge the skilled shoot and charge to get some licks in. But I was basically going to be forced into a round of melee, 2 rounds of melee before I could break off. The Lancers were within 3 and I couldn't stop them, so they ploughed into the end. However, all credit to Robin, he pulled a blinder that I did not see coming. he charged with the Mamluks. He didn't evade. He charged at an angle. So basically what I wanted him to do, but he managed to angle it. So, well, I'm assuming I'm going to give him credit for it because it was a genius move. The way he came in, the way he aligned, he was able to slide his M Mamluk line one way, the other two Mamluk line the other way, creating a two wide gap against one of my skilled bow shooters. The reason that is so significant is his brother knights are too wide and standing behind his Mamluks. So not only could I not break off, so I was in for melee. So the melee for the Lancers was green. So yeah, it was a skull off basically on that side. My skilled archers in the middle were down because they're average facing superior, so they weren't having a great time. It didn't take particularly many wounds. The Lancers, however, got gutted. He sculled me completely down the line. He broke the Lancers. He broke the outside unit of the Lancers in the first turn, in the first turn of melee. So they disappeared off, leaving the other facing off against six. He had taken almost no damage at this point. My skilled shooters whiffed on white dice in the way in, did nothing. I think they caused a wound. And the skilled were getting slightly cut up in the middle as well. I think they were down a couple of bases each. And then the brother knights hit. And I mean, they hit. He shattered, I think, on the first dice. It just blew a hole straight through. Basically, by the end of turn 2, my cavalry was gone. He destroyed it all. I hadn't. Sod's law, of course, I managed to kill one of the brother knights, obviously. So his brother knights were slightly weakened, but it cost him 2 bases, I think, for my entire cavalry wing. Gone completely. So it was not looking good at that point, as you can guess. So he's pursued right past my flank of my infantry. So I did the only thing I could do, and I charged my infantry as far forward against his as I could. I just kept going at him. The shooting was really good. The skill guard archers changed their targets from his cavalry to his infantry. We basically blew his line of infantry away. The one unit of reserve, as I said earlier, my usual delaying unit was now required to delay, but it had to go stand in front of 3 units of Mamluks and the brother knights, and they did their job. They slowed them down long enough for the infantry to do enough damage that I think it ended as a 10-15. I managed to shoot away a lot of his infantry before he crumped my flank. But yeah, I had a plan, but yeah, one of those things. To be honest, my plan was probably a little bolder than it should have been, and the green dice just exacerbated it. But it was a cracking game, though, and it was Robin's usual great painting. Oh, it's lovely, and there you go. So that was game 3.
But yeah, and it's about the dice. It also sounds like Robin played a really good game.
Totally, he saw what I was going to do, and as I say, the getting the brother knights in exactly the right position where he got the alignment before I could do the alignment, because I think it was his command deck. It was brilliant. Kudos to him. It was great. If I'd had the cards, I'd have managed to break off, and I'd have probably delayed it. I'd have lost, I suspect, eventually, but it wouldn't have been quite so drastic as it was. But yeah, really well played by him. A deserved 15 points.
There's a good point there that people don't always pick up on, is that if you can initiate a combat in your turn, it is a significant advantage if you're the active player, because you've got the choice of files and you've got the potential to align, and that can, in close situations, that can often be a deciding factor.
Totally agree. As I say, didn't see it coming. The way he'd angled his troops, it was brilliant. It really was a really sweet move, and I'm desperate to try and use it against him at some point just to prove a point. But
Opponents beware.
No, cracking game. So that got me another 10 points. So I was so 3 10s. So I'd had three bloody scores, so to speak. and that set me up for Mr. Stead with his Chin Chinese on Sunday afternoon. Now, I have to say, my games against Stephen recently have just been brilliant. They're just played in such good humour, and doesn't matter what we use, they've been fantastic. And this was another great game. From what I can remember, the left flank was secure with woods. There was a vineyard at the back of Stephen's deployment zone, but otherwise that was it. No, yeah, there was a I can't remember if it was a mountain or a vineyard on my flank, which was originally Stephen had put it on, but I got the dice and I'd moved it up onto mine. Again, I made the same mistake I gave against Robin. I deployed wide because there was no terrain. I just deployed wide. I was having a real moment that Sunday, and I don't know why I did it. But reverse of my game against Robin, basically. So my infantry ran from the secure flank on the left to the center of the table. Then all my cavalry was out on the right. And of course, if you know what the Chin Chinese army is, the one Stephen runs is it's the conscript spearmen, which are front rank polearm, back 2 ranks crossbows, and then he has the combat G. I can't remember what they're called, but basically the polearm loose order dev chargers. 3 blocks of those as his punch troops. He doesn't run the chariots. He runs the crossbow polearm cavalry and 3 blocks of the light horse skirmishers. So, as I say, it was genuinely a complete reverse of the Robin game in my deployment area. I end up with my cavalry facing off against his ally, which is a mixture of the close order dev charging, the loose order dev charging polearms, and 2 blocks of the crossbowman polearm infantry. His center was where, next to those, he had his light horse and his cavalry. Then facing off against my infantry is 3 blocks of his crossbowmen, spearmen, and the end of his line is anchored by another one of the loose order dev charging polearms. I had put an ambush card in the wood on the secure flank. Due to my prevalence for having cavalry in ambush, Stephen was pretty certain I had a unit of Lancer cavalry in there in ambush, so that delayed him for a while whilst he thought about whether I was genuinely about to do what I usually do. So it all kicked off basically. Unlike in my game with Robin, I was less keen to get involved in a shooting competition with his infantry because his weren't with the support. Sorry, with the support of the with the loose order dev chargers. I really didn't want to get that close. So my infantry was playing a stalling game basically of shooting at long range and hoping the cavalry can do the business. My guard infantry, my guard archer bows. First turn shot straight up the table, straight towards his light horse. Now, you know what's coming. The shooting the following turn, yeah. I immediately lose 2 bases of guards and do no damage back. So he's throwing whites, I'm throwing greens. So yeah, that's how it goes. Yeah, so the guard infantry were already screwed at that point. They were down to 6 bases in turn 1. Sorry, turn 2. As I say, because I'd gone wide, I totally misjudged. Sum it up, basically, my skilled bow got themselves, my skilled shoot and charge got themselves into a horrible mess against his ally. Didn't die quickly, but they did eventually die. I surprised Stephen when my 2 Lancer units that were behind the infantry just shot sideways at a rate of knots and went up to support the skilled archers, and they got involved in the fight on that side, which stabilized it a bit. But by the time time was called, I think I'd scored 4 points, and I think Stephen had taken 8 or 10. I think because my cavalry had crumped by that point. Well, certainly the skilled shooters had. He got a devastating charger polearm into my polearms on my left and ripped through them, and they died. He'd taken a couple of skirmishes, I think, as well. So a brilliant game, fantastically played. I deployed like a muppet, and I got paint. got taught my lesson, shall we say? But no, good game. And that was it. Basically, that's where we got to.
Sounds like you had 4 cracking games, really.
Oh, totally. Every single one of my games was great. I really enjoyed it. I rarely have a bad opponent, but where you have a game where you just get frustrated by it all. But no, not at all. I haven't thrown a chair or dice in ages. Oh, sorry, that's not me. That's somebody else. But,
we don't mention chairs.
Yes.
Okay, Richard.
So my day 2, after quite an adventure the night before, I was looking very scary on day 2. I had tripped over a curb in Weedon and sort of ended up bashing myself a bit. So I got a cracking black eye and grazes and was looking a bit of a sight. And I attribute that to the success I had on day 2. Didn't do my head any damage, fortunately, so no effect there. My first opponent on day 2 was my first opponent on day 2 was Pete Riley, who was using Mongol Conquest. Now Pete's a cracking bloke, and if you're going to be a Mongol Conquest army, you really don't want to face Tang China Northern. Because his army essentially is basically a unit of Khan's Guard who are exceptional armoured horse, protected, experienced bow, short spear, melee expert, shoot and charge. Only 4 of them, but at the price they are, you're not going to be able to afford more than 4. 2 units of armoured 2-man cavalry who are superior protected skilled bow. So there you've got superior skilled bow, short spear, melee expert. So you were asking about those, Matt. Certainly the Mongol Conquest gets them.
But not shoot and charge.
Not shoot and charge.
Yeah, it's the shoot and
charge.
charge.
Only the Khan's Guard had shoot and charge. Then 4 units of 2-man cavalry, drilled flexible, superior unprotected, skilled bow, short spear, melee expert, but again in 4s. And 2 units of other nomad cavalry who are formed, flexible, average, unprotected, experienced bow. One of those was melee expert. Only 9 units. No camp was the other option taken, with 3 competent professional and mediocre professional generals, 8 PBS, but only 4 scouting. So as the terrain turned out, it was pretty much an open plain, but I had 2 pieces of rough on either flank. And my basic tactic was to line up my army between the 2 pieces of rough. Pete really didn't know what to do because basically everybody in my army has an experienced bow, and he's got an awful lot of unprotected troops. So he basically lined them up, set the Khan's Guard to lead the attack on his left flank, my right, against some of my Fubing, and it developed from there. He allowed the Khan's Guard to get outflanked by my infantry archers, which he then lost his nerve a bit and worried about. My reaction was, they're Khan's Guard, they're exceptional short spear melee expert shoot and charge. They don't worry about things to their flank. You send them in. And indeed, they proved to be the unit that did the damage to me. But the rest of his army basically was getting outshot by my protective experienced bow infantry in large numbers, and my protected experienced bow cavalry being able to swamp the rest of his army, basically. So I can't remember the final score, but I got 15, and I think Pete might have got 4 points or something like that. But it was a bad matchup for Pete.
It's a pretty terrible matchup because it's obviously you can swap base for base.
Yeah,
Well, you can swap base for base and win 15-0, basically.
Well, not quite because of the Khan's Guard, but
Yeah.
that would, yeah. I mean, the fours. The problem he gets is as soon as he loses a base and the cavalry are down to threes, they're struggling to match me in shooting power, and I mean, they can run away, but you can only run away for so long, and that doesn't score you points.
Yeah.
So tough matchup. So that gave me a final round against Hammy, our host for the day, and he'd taken a Ghaznavid army. Now, the thing with Ghaznavids is armored elephants. If you're going to go Ghaznavid, you probably want to go armored elephants, because, and sure enough, Hammy had done that. So his army was it's instinctive commanders, competent, talented sub, and 2 more competent. So he had plenty of cards. He had 2 units of 3 armored elephants. So those are the elephants that are fully armored. He had 3 units of gillmen who are superior protected, experienced bow, short spear. He had 4 units of flexible, average unprotected, 2 experienced bow, 2 skilled bow. Those were 6s. The gillmans were in 4s. A unit of Dailami mercenaries, drilled, flexible, average protected, depth charger, melee expert, and a unit of poor unprotected, experienced bow combat shy archers that sat at the rear and did nothing, along with his poor unfortified camp. The Hammy chose to deploy with again, the terrain was pretty open. There was 1 piece of rough on my left flank, his right flank, and he chose to deploy the elephants next to that rough with the Dailami in the rough. He then deployed his cavalry in the centre, and out towards the right. My deployment opposite him was, I had some infantry in the rough, just the 1 unit of Bubing. I had the Tujay, who basically were opposite his elephants. I'd had to deploy first. I then had further infantry in the centre, and I had the Khitan on my extreme right. The battle was really made up of 2 key elements. The first was that I realised that my Khitan were in danger of getting swamped, so I tried to redeploy them closer to my infantry and centre. In doing so, Hammy spotted that I had left myself vulnerable and pushed forward rapidly with his cavalry to try and take advantage of that. My heroes were the skilled Khitan horse archers, who, despite being unprotected, they were in skirmish formation. Hammy shot at them, must have shot at them 4 or 5 turns, and I think in the end they'd lost 1 base.
You're so lucky.
Yeah. Yeah, I could easily have had that flank crumble, and in fact they held up. The other Khitan horse archers were also fairly heroic. They basically were lined up against one of his skilled bow, and they just basically, each time I pushed forward, Hammy, having the extra cards, would drop back to increase the range to over 1 base width. So I was on whites, he was on greens, and they survived long enough to keep pushing him back until they were behind his Gillman in the centre. I charged the Guildmen with my Wuxi cavalry, they're the charging lancer ones, and was basically able to break those, and the horse archers behind suffered as well. Meanwhile, the critical thing for the battle was the elephants on the other flank. He, having deployed his elephants opposite my Turkish cavalry, he decided there was nothing for it but to advance and try and make most of the opportunity, supported by the Dailami. In doing so, however, a gap appeared between that and the rest of his cavalry, and I pushed the Fubing archers and the guard spearmen through that gap and basically exposed the flank of his elephants. Left with a choice of either ignoring the threat to his flank and carrying on, or turning, he decided to turn one of the elephants to take on the archers who had threatened his flank. Personally, I think that was the wrong decision, but you can argue it either way. The net effect was, in doing so, he basically allowed my Touge to gang up against his remaining elephant unit. The Fubing took on the armoured elephants, and it was always going to be quite a close run thing. In the end, I survived and he broke by 1 wound. And after twice charging, I think, the armoured elephants in the flank with the cavalry, I eventually broke the other unit of elephants. That and the losses in the centre were enough to break the army, and somehow I got a 15-0.
Oh, wow.
Which wasn't deserved. But yeah, it sort of capped off the end of a rather successful Sunday for me. So, but elephants, you can't afford to expose the flank of elephants. It doesn't matter that they're fully armoured and they're good. They once you start getting the overlaps and on the flanks of elephants, their days are numbered. Yeah, it was that pushing. It was because I had I was the active player, and I was able to push through that gap that had developed between these elephants and cavalry. That was what won the game.
What did you think of Hami's army? Because I remember when I list checked it, because it's one of those sort of armies I like that style of. But I thought it was a bit something and nothing. Wasn't quite one thing or the other.
Yeah, I couldn't quite see. I'm not a fan of trying to use elephants with essentially shooty cavalry. He only had he's got the 2 elephants and the Dailami, and the rest is the sort of shooty cavalry.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem I think it's always going to have is that the elephants, you can't protect both flanks of the elephants. And yeah, that's my feeling about that list, is that you've got the 2 elephants and the Dailami as a powerful force, but it needs an extra something to protect the other flank of the elephants. And then you've got to use the army with the elephants, because the elephants are no good in defense. They've got to be used in attack. And so to me, that's the weakness with that army choice.
Yeah. Sounds reasonable to me. So, is it over to me now?
Yes, your second day games.
It is, yes, indeed. Okay, so my first game on Sunday was against Lee Sanders using Yuan Dynasty Chinese, which is another one of those lists that I think you can play around with for ages, trying to get what you think is a good list out of it and failing. But I thought Lee came up with an absolutely stonking Yuan list, which I promptly stole, and it's squirreled away for my use at some stage, perhaps. He'd gone for a Chagatai ally along with the Yuan. So his Yuan bit is 3 generals, a competent, a talented and mediocre professional generals. He's got a 6 base unit of the Khan's best cavalry, drilled loose, superior protected, skilled bow, short spear, melee expert. A Mongol best cavalry unit, which is basically the same but average. 2 units of Mongol cavalry, form flexible, average unprotected, skilled bow, short spear, one of which was dismountable. No doubt he had some points left over. 2 8s of crossbowmen, drilled loose, protected, experienced crossbow. And 2 units of provincial archers, formed loose, unprotected, unskilled bow, combat shy. One thing about the Yuan list is you have to have at least a third of the infantry units as poor. So in this case, you got half of them, but they're 2 very cheap units. The Chagadai ally was a unit, who are Mongols, a unit of best cavalry, drilled loose, average protected, skilled bow, short spear, and 2 4s of form flexible, average unprotected, skilled bow, short spear. So it's got 2 really quite useful units of crossbowmen, which in 8s are dead useful. The fact that crossbow, as I said a bit earlier, can wound on an S result if they are charged is really nice. And he's got quite a lot of skilled shooters and certainly 1 really good combat unit. You could argue perhaps it's still a bit of a mixed army. Oh, sorry, he's also got 1 unit of skirmish cavalry, who are cavalry skirmishers, average unprotected, skilled bow. Expensive, but nice. They're 90 points a base. So I thought that was really possibly the best Yuan army I've seen. It's definitely one of those lists that can be a bit frustrating in my experience. Okay, so before you know, Lee also won on a strategic intercept against me. But I again defended. I had vineyard on my right, a vineyard sort of front, left, centre, and a vineyard on my left. So my army had a sort of really quite nice position, and basically most of the rest of the table was open. I deployed with a shooting unit in vineyard on my left, and a unit of my cavalry, a unit of the vanguard swordsmen, and a unit of the crossbow infantry to go and advance into the vineyard that was front left of mine. Then the rest of my infantry to the right of those. Then I had a gap of about 6 base widths. Then the guard cavalry, and then another unit of the crossbow infantry and the militia archers were going into the vineyard on the right, although they had to maneuver a bit to get into position. And I had 2 units of the basic cavalry sitting behind the lines in reserve position, sort of either side of the gap. The gap in my line was something of a attempt for Lee to come at. Looks like there's a big hole in my line, and I really wanted to draw him in because I've got the vineyards I can shoot from. Is a bit of a risk. Lee's a very good player, and Yuan can certainly exploit things. Lee deployed his Chagadai ally on the right. Then his 2 big units of crossbowmen were facing the vineyard that was to my front and left centre. So they were obviously aiming to pile forward there. And then all the rest of his Mongol cavalry were on the left, including his best cavalry, who were more or less opposite my guard cavalry. So one thing that was a factor in this game is that I don't think Lee had played a game with vineyards before. And it was a bit of a surprise to him when he found out that troops in vineyards could shoot out without penalty, but when he was shooting in, there would be penalties. So, that ended up changing the dynamic of the game from, I think, what he had expected. The game to some extent developed with Lee coming forward to me, but I have to say I did have a plan for going out to him as well. I think you have to, although the position I had was a nice defensive one, all good for me. But if somebody doesn't come in, you're going to get no points. And in fact, that did happen in my last game as well. So Lee pushed forward, not so hard on the right, and he didn't rush his crossbowmen straight at the vineyard because I had some my troops are quite combat competent, and obviously sitting in cover, he knew he wasn't going to outshoot me, even though he didn't necessarily have clocked the vineyard's advantages. So Lee pushed forward. I manoeuvred troops so that my 2 units of reserve cavalry were covering the gap. So if he came into it, it would be dangerous for him. And I wheeled my infantry on sort of in my centre so that the gap was less of a gap and flanks weren't being exposed. So that is my mind successfully drawn Lee forward into position. At one point, he'd actually slightly overcommitted with one of his Mongol cavalry units as unprotected and in loose formation. And I could push forward one of the units of crossbowmen and therefore get 3 shots on green dice, which, you know, thought, hey, great, bonus at the beginning. I promptly rolled 3 blanks, of course, in the shooting, and so I was thinking, oh, good grief, it's going to be one of those games, isn't it? So anyway, Lee carried on pushing forward cautiously as he realised what the vineyards actually meant in terms of him shooting, but he had probably slightly overcommitted at this point. But I then pushed my guard cavalry straight up into the face of his best cavalry. My intention here was for them to really sort of act as a bit of a block and just tie down that best unit, and then I'll be able to pick on his other units with my shooting, where I've got more shoot, and start to gang up on his unprotected units and hopefully bully them, end up isolating his best cavalry, and hopefully attrit his unprotected units and work on the army that way. On my left, I was slowly pushing towards the Chagadai ally to engineer where I could get shots at advantage. But once I got into the position of the guard cavalry being right in the face of his best cavalry, and the way the other cavalry had stood, I decided that although I was going to be an isolated unit, it was actually appropriate to charge in. The shoot and charge gives me a slight advantage, hopefully, and after that, it's all fairly even. But as I said, by sort of pinning his line in place, hopefully I can work on with the shooting. It turns out my guard cavalry, after their ignominious performance against the Fatimids, had decided to rediscover the form they'd had against the Khwarezmians, but then take it up a notch. This turned out to be an appallingly brutal combat that was very one-sided. On the shoot and charge, I did 1 wound, so that wasn't very much. Lee had 5 black dice shooting back because I'm armoured horse and superior. So he's on black S's, and he just did 1 wound on that. So we've both taken a wound, and then we've got 3 combats where I am green and he is white, because he shot. I've shot as well. I've shot on shoot and charge, and we're both superior. We've both got short spear. Lee, out of his 3 white dice, rolled 1 wound, and all 3 of my green dice were skulls. So I break his unit in the charge. Literally, it couldn't get better than that, but it did. His general was with the best cavalry unit, although he hadn't been fighting. So when his unit breaks, I get a cab on the general. Now, I didn't kill the general. The result, I certainly told a few people at the competition because it was so brutal. The result was actually in some ways better. I stunned the general, so he lost all his cards. Lee had stacked this general with 6 cards out of the 12 for his army. His whole left wing now had 0 cards.
Oh,
wow.
And my movement is to come. Advantage shooting. It was absolutely horrific. They just, on that side of the battlefield, then I could pretty much do what I wanted. I genuinely don't think I've seen a Meg combat. I've seen one-sided combats and quick breaks in, but it was a combination of results. And I can't remember what the cabs did. I think I actually knocked a couple of bases off with cabs as well, or wounds and then shooting added up to bases. It was horrific. So at this point he's then got something like 3 unprotected cavalry units that I can gang up on and get shooting for the next turn come with that as well. So it really was wow moment, and possibly to add yet another insult to the injury, his route was as short as it could be, which left my guard cavalry well in the vicinity of his other units for subsequent action. I mean, it almost was. It could not have gone worse for Lee. I lost a base, and he lost a unit and all his cards for that half of the battlefield. I was stunned. I think we were both stunned, quite frankly. Not just his general, we were stunned. So, as you might guess, that it was a bit downhill from there, really. Lee felt he had to push with the troops he did have, because he couldn't really extradite them on his other wing. He certainly couldn't extradite the ones that had been commanded by the general who had got no shooting. So I got a lot of shooting in next time. He pushed his crossbowmen up into the vicinity of the vineyard, and in subsequent moves I was able to charge them and break both of them. I picked on and killed other cavalry, but it really that taking out his best cavalry sealed that game. It really was just such a devastating blow, and it ended up I won 15-0, which, you know, I just said wow when Richard said he won 15-0. This is even more a wow to me, that this, you know, because Lee is such a good player. He's a very good player. He got a well-designed list. Okay, he didn't really, the vineyards came as a bit of a surprise to him, but he's a good enough player to be able to manage that. It was just the hole I knocked in his line and the knock-on effect. So that was just a wow. You know, what more can you say? So 3 games out of 3, 45 points maximum. I then face Mr. Hall. So in the same way as I fought Paul Cummings in the second game at Warfare, in the last game at Warfare I played Simon. So playing him again on top table, this time for the competition. Simon has Mongol conquest, which is going to be a challenge. We played a game between Christmas and New Year as well, and the cracking game. And Simon was ahead of 9-8, I think, at the end of that one. But that was really good. And he's had more practice since then. He's definitely getting well up to speed. In fact, I'd say he's back up to his best. Anyway, his army was 4 competent generals, 3 of them professional, 1 of them instinctive. That's the nomad vassal subgeneral. No, that's subgeneral, not ally general. He got 9 tugs. Khan's Guard, he'd not gone for the armoured horse version. He'd got drilled loose, exceptional, protected, skilled bow, short spear, melee expert. Just 4 of those. 2 4s of basically the same but superior, the armoured 2-men. 3 6s of the ordinary Mongol cavalry. These had been downgraded to average, unprotected, skilled bow, short spear. And 3 units of the nomad horsemen, who are the nomad vassals, and they all form 1 command. Average, unprotected bow, 2 4s and a 6, the 6 being skilled. So a lot of skilled. He's got 12 cars, PBS of 8, scouting of 5. Simon won the PBS dice roll, so this was the 4th time I'd been strategically intercepted. Now, at this point, especially after our conversations, the game we'd had between Christmas and New Year, where Simon had invaded me, and I'd had quite a bit of terrain and been able to use that to my advantage to cut down his manoeuvrability. I had assumed that Simon would defend in the plains. He's got no camp. Okay, that means he has to deploy a camp, which is mobile. But I personally didn't want to fight in the plains, where I thought just the sheer mobility and lack of any cover would give the Mongols the advantage. Simon actually invaded, and when we chatted about it afterwards, his view was that he didn't think he would be able to stop his camp from being sacked. And with an army of only 9 tugs, and a lot of them in 4s, that was too big a risk. He felt he had to have the no camp, even if that gave me terrain. So I thought it was an interesting choice. I'm still not convinced it was the right choice. Simon is, so pays your money, pays your. So in a way, we're both happy. So had the hills, steep, the mountains on one side, my left flank, and the only other piece of terrain was a couple of vineyards again. See, vineyards are just everywhere this competition, covering my right flank, quite close to my base edge. So I've got basically Simon's half of the table is more or less free, apart from his compulsory terrain on his right-hand side. I deploy with a couple of units of shooters in the vineyard on my right. It's the unit of crossbowmen and the militia. My thinking is I'm probably going to pivot off that piece of terrain. I'm thinking I'm almost certainly going to have to come out. I'm not going to get lucky and have somebody charge, get really close up and fall for that again. On the left-hand side in the mountains, I've got 2 more units of the crossbowmen. The aim there is to pressurize Simon's right flank by coming off the hill and pressurizing it. The main part of my infantry and the guard cavalry are deployed in the big gap in the center, and all my ordinary cavalry and the skirmishing horse archers are basically reserves set back a bit from that. So we then have a game of an enormous amount of thinking, really, really tense, lots of thinking, but played at a reasonable speed, but whilst being cagey. Simon didn't come piling in and allow me to shoot from the terrain. I did have to go out. I mean, we had so much jockeying and not overcommitting that we didn't really have any casualties till about 2 hours into the game before a unit was broken. You know, at one point I was starting to think of, are we actually going to get a result? But then things started to happen. So, you know, Simon's pushed forward. He's trying to get into shooting range. I am trying to get, you know, I push my infantry forward and then I'll pull the infantry back so that I'm shooting at 4. He can't shoot at me. I'm happy to have my guard cavalry shot at to some degree because they've got the armored horse and they're superior. So again, jockeying. On my left, I'm pushing my 2 units of crossbowmen out. Sorry, I've not really described Simon's deployment, have I? Basically, his nomad ally was on the left. He's got his best cavalry, his superiors and exceptionals in the centre, and the rest of his Mongol cavalry is mostly on the right. So he's got a hard centre, and all his unprotected stuff is on the wings. So he's being reasonably cautious, but not overly so. You know, he's willing to push up and take a few shots if he has to, and pull back and buy off wounds. And if he has to get close, he's putting them in skirmish formation. Basically, this is going on. In the end, I end up deliberately leaving one of my units of infantry somewhat forward to give him a target to come in at. So that draws him in, and his charge is actually reasonably effective. And I'm possibly thinking, oh, that was a bad idea, but I'm continuing to push on the left, and he's having to give way, and also on the right. So I'm starting to actually start to envelop a Mongol army with most of my infantry. So, which is a really nice feeling. Aware that we've been talking quite a while. So long story short, really, he charges in his good stuff, and it doesn't quite break through. It gets a little bogged down, and he pulls it back. My guard cavalry go after a unit of ordinary Mongol cavalry. 6 of the Tumen cavalry are unprotected, and so basically pushing straight down the middle of the table. we charge him. My shoot and charge slows him by 1, and he rolls down on his VMD, and I slam into the rear of it, and it explodes in a fairly rewarding manner, shall we say. So I mean, the guard cavalry don't have to do any heroic dice rolling on this one. Charging the enemy in the rear is usually quite good, although I think it took all 3 files and had to roll, because all I ever rolled was wounds. But if you're rolling 2 wounds on each file and you've done something on the shoot and charge, it breaks them anyway. So it was a thing. So Simon then launches another attack with a very well timed, very well coordinated, well chosen attack with his exceptionals and superiors, and he basically gets within a base of breaking through. He would have broken through, got into my camp, and really caused me problems. I think it was something like he had to roll 2 wounds on a red, yellow, and a green dice, and he only got 1 of them. And that was just enough. I think I could buy off a wound and then bring things in on the flanks. At which point, I say his army is now 2/3 surrounded. On my left flank, I end up charging 1 unit front and rear with my infantry. I get a couple of flank charges. Simon has a desperation rear charge into my guard cavalry, which actually knocks 2 bases off. But then I turn round and butcher him, and then the flank attacks take down his army. It was an incredibly good game. It really was very fluid. Really felt like these 2 armies probably should feel. Mine, Simon could be very mobile. I have to be quite deliberate and be quite cautious. Certainly at the point where he failed to get the 2nd wound, it was a case of, I think we both thought Simon had at least his fingertips on the trophy at that point, and then it was just snatched away from him by cruel fate. Not that I'm feeling too upset about this, of course. So I win, I can't remember, it was 15-6, something like that. But from my point of view, the important thing, I've just won 4 games on the trot. I've got 60 points. I can't be beaten. And so, you can imagine I feel incredibly pleased about that. So, and I thought I played that particular game very well, as did Simon, and proved to myself I did have a proper plan for coming out of the terrain and not just sitting in terrain all weekend, and I could beat a Mongol army on a fairly open table, as long as I had a little bit of something to work with. Overall, I think I felt the army performed an awful lot better than I expected it to. I'd expected mid-table mediocrity, maybe a bit above if I was lucky. To win 4 games, 15 points each, was just really rewarding, basically. I suspect it's all downhill from here this year now. So that was my result, and I should say the prizes that were presented by Battlefield Hobbies, which were vouchers to use in store, were very generous. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, we all got something, and Ray had organised for a prize as well for the best rookie, which was defined as person who has not played more than this was either their 1st, 2nd, or 3rd competition, and that was won by Matt McVeigh, and I think that was his 1st competition with an army he'd borrowed from Simon. So I think that was an incredibly successful prize as well.
Well deserved.
Very well deserved. Very well deserved. So I think it was a really successful tournament, a slightly different theme.
Yeah, the army choices were great. I thought people really took the spirit of what Ray was trying to achieve, I think, and went with some interesting choices. I think we need to talk about the 2nd place list, the Bantu Kingdoms with
Yes.
Newell.
It was interesting. We actually had 2 armies from the African list, didn't we? Because Paul Stovall, who you played, had the Abyssinian, and Ian Newell indeed had the Bantu, which it's just a huge mass of, was it unprotected
Shield, unprotected, shield cover, devastating charges.
Fleet of foot.
Fleet of foot.
And melee expert.
And melee expert, yes, that's right.
It was just an enormous. I know Simon played it with his Mongols. I think it's one of those. If his shooting had been a little bit worse than it was, he'd have just been absolutely swamped.
Yeah, I looked at that list and thought, I don't ever want to play that list. It was just like, I think it's something like 120 bases of infantry.
It was enormous.
Yeah, it
was something like 19 Ugs, wasn't it? 19 tugs.
You needed to kill 8 to break the army.
No, maybe 17, 18, whatever.
I think it was 8. You needed to break the army, but it was so basically it's a Zulu army. And as the weekend was Isandwana and Rorke's Drift, I thought it was very apt to be running it at that competition, particularly as he 30 pointed on Saturday for Isandwana and then didn't do quite so well on the Sunday.
Absolutely, I must admit, I was thinking I would have loved to fought that one. It was. Oh, so it's 15 units. I'm just checking. You know, it's 4 of them were superior, all the rest average. Yeah. Average, unprotected, fleet of foot, dev charger, melee expert, shield cover.
Absolutely magnificent army choice. It was brilliant.
Superb army choice. I'm not sure. I don't know what to do about it. How do I protect my flanks?
My plan was to charge all my cavalry in as soon as I could and hope they took enough down that by the time he got to the infantry, they were wounded enough that the artillery and the shooting kill enough.
I suspect mine might have been similar. And hope the guard cavalry did unto them what they did unto Lee, basically.
Well, all I'll say is that it's an army that I've got lined up to use.
Oh no!
At some point this year. I've had it waiting in the wings for 2 years.
But Ian beat you to it.
He did, yes.
I must admit, I also think he had enormous fun using it. Every time I saw him, he just had a massive smile on his face.
Yeah, I credit to him. I wouldn't have had the courage to take it to a competition where there are so many cavalry present, but
no,
obviously that didn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think basically he won 3 and he went down to like 15-10 to Simon. That was
Simon who.
It was an astonishing. Well, I thought we had as Matt said, a really interesting choice of lists were chosen for the competition. I think it was a great success. So, okay, time is ticking on, gentlemen. So, just ask, what are our plans for future games or future competitions? Because we've got another one up shortly, haven't we?
Yeah, we're coming up to Beachhead, which is classical armies with a Punic theme, if possible. I don't know.
Well, yes, it's slightly odd. It's sort of requested that if it'd be nice if people took Punic Wars armies.
Yeah. So that is my intention, is to take a list that is borderline Punic.
I'm afraid I've gone for one that isn't, but he's sort of similar to some armies that could be in period. So I've not gone for anything wild and wacky in that respect. So are you there, Matt?
I'm not at the moment. I think I've got work commitments which haven't been firmed up yet. But if they fall through and they're odd in numbers, I will certainly try and snaffle a ticket. So I've got a Syracusean Greek that's never hit the table that needs to come out and play.
Right. He has to come out and play.
Yes, must, yes.
So and in terms of podcast, I think the plan is, if I'm right, gentlemen, to do a historical one next time around.
Yeah, we would. I think we're possibly looking at one of the more conventional armies. I think we talked about Romans possibly. I
think we did.
We did indeed, yes.
Romans, possibly of that classic early imperial age.
Indeed, yes.
So that looks like it'll be the next one. Obviously, we'll be keeping an eye on competitions as well, just keeping people up to date with those. But obviously, this isn't just a podcast about competitions, although people seem popular. The ones we do seem popular in that respect.
Yeah, just a non-competition event. Dave Sellers and Lee Sanders are running a Meg battle at the Society of Ancients Battle Day, which is in March, and will be held at Shaw House in Newbury.
Okay. So what battle is being run this year?
This year it's the Battle of Adrianople.
Oh, right.
So Goths and late Romans.
Yes. What one as fans of the late Empire sort of draw a polite veil over.
Well, if you want to get rid of an emperor, having killed in command of his army by a bunch of barbarians.
Yes, yes. It didn't go exactly to plan, did it, for the Romans?
It's the way to get rid of an emperor.
It certainly got rid of him. That's for sure. Okay, Matt, Richard, thank you very much for taking part on this. And I look forward to the next time we meet up to talk about Romans.
Yes,
Indeed.
looking forward to it. I'll have to do some research. I'm shoddy in my Roman history, I have to admit. Yeah,
it's the wrong end of the empire for me, as far as I'm concerned. So I'll be joining you, looking at. It involves reading Asterix books, basically, doesn't it?
Oh, totally. Yeah. That's where I'm starting. I might be finishing there as well.
Yeah. Okay, folks. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you next time.